This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to PM. I'm David Lipson. Tonight, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott in Taiwan lashes out against China in a speech set to create waves in Beijing. Also, vaccine booster shots on the way for hundreds of thousands of immunocompromised Australians. And Nobel Prize winner Professor Peter Doherty outlines the risks as the nation starts to open, even for those double-dose vaccinated.
Particularly older people are very much at risk, even though they are double vaccinated, because they just don't make very good immune responses due to the fact that their immune systems have declined. So they're very much at risk, and you can still get reasonably unwell from what we call a breakthrough infection.
Thanks for your company. On a week when record numbers of Chinese warplanes have flown into Taiwan's air defence identification zone, escalating fears of military brinkmanship, Australia's former Prime Minister Tony Abbott has used a stage in Taiwan to launch a strongly worded criticism of China's government. He described the superpower as belligerent and blamed Beijing for escalating tension in the region. Mr. Abbott stopped short of supporting Taiwan's independence, but the unofficial visit and speech is likely to complicate relations with China even further. Here's Bill Birtles.
First of all, we would like to welcome the Honourable Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, who has travelled to Taiwan despite the pandemic, to give us his remarks. Please welcome him with a warm round of applause.
Tony Abbott's efforts to travel to Taiwan this week weren't lost on his Taiwanese hosts. He's been feted like a current leader, given formal meetings with the island's president and foreign minister. And in front of both of them at a forum in Taipei today, he didn't mince his words.
2 years back, I hesitated to attend this conference, lest that provoke China. But since then, as you know, Beijing has torn up the one country, two systems treaty on Hong Kong. It's put upwards of 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps. It's boosted cyber spying on its own citizens, cancelled popular personalities in favour of a cult of the Red Emperor, brutalised Indian soldiers in the Himalayas, coerced other claimants in its eastern seas, and flown ever more intimidatory sorties against Taiwan.
Other ex-PMs, particularly Malcolm Turnbull, have been publicly critical of China's actions, and Mr Turnbull spoke to the same Taiwanese forum via video last year. But Mr Abbott, in person, has sought to make a bigger impact.
It's weaponised trade, especially against Australia, with our barley, wine and coal exports all stopped on spurious grounds. And its embassy has published 14 demands, essentially that we become a tributary state that no self-respecting country could accept.
China claims it should rule Taiwan and routinely pressures foreign politicians and other organisations to shun the island. Tony Abbott didn't shut the door completely on seeking better ties with China, and he acknowledged its huge economic contribution to Australia's growth. But with China flying more Air Force planes than ever before near Taiwan, as it insists it must take control of the island within the next few decades, Tony Abbott said it's more important than ever to stand with Taiwan.
So if the drums of war can be heard in our region, as an official of ours has noted, it's not Australia that's beating them.
The Morrison government says Mr Abbott is in Taiwan in a private capacity and is not an unofficial envoy. Richard McGregor, a China analyst at the Lowy Institute, says Beijing will likely take that into account in how it views the visit.
We can criticise his speech or praise his speech on its own terms, but there's no reason why he shouldn't be allowed to go there and speak. It's a free country, both Taiwan and Australia, and Mr Abbott, is free to do what he wants. Whether in fact he helped the bilateral relationship Probably not.
So far, China's government media hasn't mentioned Mr Abbott's visit at all, but it has described a current visit by a group of French senators as seriously provocative. This is Bill Birtles reporting for PM.
Meanwhile, in some unusually frank commentary, the Reserve Bank of Australia is warning the demise of Chinese property developer Evergrande could trigger a collapse of the superpower's financial system. In its latest financial stability review, the RBA acknowledges the heavily indebted property developer faces a liquidity crisis, and a company wind-up could trigger wider stress in China's financial and real estate sectors. Evergrande is facing one of the country's largest ever defaults as it wrestles with more than $300 billion of debt. Business reporter David Taylor explains what it means for Australia.
Australia's largest trading partner, China, is staring down another financial crisis.
I think it is, but we're talking a much longer time horizon. And the issue here isn't just solely Evergrande, but it's Evergrande as part of the broader crackdown that the government has launched on the property sector.
China watcher Denny McMahon is the author of China's Great Wall of Debt. His views coincide with frank warnings from Australia's Reserve Bank about the risks a collapse of the property developer pose to China's financial system. In its financial stability review, the RBA warns that if the Chinese government acts, quote, too quickly in addressing these vulnerabilities, confidence in the implicit guarantees that underpin much of China's financial system could collapse, which would lead to financial distress. One recent example is Evergrande, the bank adds, and whose collapse could trigger wider stress in China's financial and real estate sectors. Wing Chung is managing editor at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. She says China's Communist Party is acutely aware of what's at stake.
The Chinese government does realise that real estate sector is important to the economy, and on top of that, it is important for the social stability of China, because in China, a lot of people's savings, assets are tied up in real estate, more so than in many other countries.
The world's most heavily indebted property developer began making headlines earlier this year when it was revealed it couldn't easily pay its bills. There were concerns its demise could trigger either a Chinese debt crisis or a global credit crunch. Fears rose to a new level when its shares were placed in a trading halt earlier this month. Since then, it's been revealed it's unable to pay its suppliers and agents, and other property developers have shown signs of financial distress. Bloomberg's David Q says property investors are already fretting they've lost all of their money in Evergrande. But that's triggering a much bigger problem.
For a macro picture, people are worrying about whether this Evergrande case would trigger more concern about developer spending, and which may lead to wider range of tight funding for developers, and also maybe default by developers.
The price of Australia's key export, iron ore, has already collapsed on the back of this crisis and a big fall in demand for steel. David Q warns the economic impact for Australia will get worse before it gets better.
China would continue to reduce the capacity in the steel sector. So in this way, I think we still have some downward pressure for the iron ore prices. But as I find, it has dropped a lot.
Alarmingly, David Q says it's impossible to determine at this point how serious the crisis may be for China and Australia.
Well, it's very hard. To be honest, it's very hard to estimate how much the impact could be.
Another wild card, says Denny McMahon, is how exposed Chinese local governments are to the health of the property sector.
Local governments are hugely dependent on their own cash flow from selling land. Now, the impact of Evergrande defaulting and a handful of other large property developers defaulting as well means that all of a sudden you have a supply of not only the land that they've bought and haven't developed now comes onto market, but you have all their projects sort of come onto market as well. And so local governments are trying to sell land now in competition to distressed developers that are trying to flog off their own projects.
China is coming to the end of a 7-day holiday, and regulators there have not made any comments specifically on Evergrande and its woes. The central bank, however, on Wednesday urged financial institutions to cooperate with relevant departments and local governments to maintain the stable and healthy development of the property market and safeguard housing consumers' interests.
That's David Taylor. You're listening to PM on radio on the ABC Listen app and via podcast. I'm David Lipson. Coming up, a blow for advocates of voluntary assisted dying in the ACT and Northern Territory, with the federal government knocking back attempts to pass euthanasia laws. We hear from one of those who say the sick and elderly should be allowed to die with dignity.
He had no independence and really no quality of life. And I think that's a really important question here, is the quality of life over the quantity of life that people are subjected to live to. And in particular for his circumstance, he got to a point in time in his life where he made the choice that he really didn't want to live anymore.
Well, 12.4 million Australians are now double-dose vaccinated against COVID, about 60% of over 16s. And next month, the federal government will start rolling out its third round of doses, starting with the country's most vulnerable, immunosuppressed residents. It's good timing for those with compromised immune systems in Victoria, a state that has once again recorded the country's highest number of daily cases, and for those in New South Wales, where COVID is likely to surge again as lockdown restrictions lift. Isabel Rowe reports.
Claire Brennan is one of those people who can't just live with COVID in the community.
If I was to catch COVID, it wouldn't be good. I could go into organ rejection.
The Melbourne resident is an organ transplant recipient and severely immunosuppressed, and as of today is eligible for a third dose of a COVID vaccine.
I had my second dose about 8 weeks ago. So I had AstraZeneca because it was the first vaccine that I could get my hands on.
Do you think you'll go as soon as you can?
Yeah, absolutely. Any coverage and safety that I can get, I'm all for. COVID's definitely more riskier than waiting.
Chief Medical Officer Paul Kelly says 500,000 Australians are now eligible for a booster shot.
Just to give you a sense of who is covered, it's people that were already seen in phase 1 of the vaccine rollout to be priority groups, so people with active blood malignancy, blood cancer, people that have had organ transplants, people that have had stem cell transplants, people on immunosuppressive therapies.
The nation's expert group on vaccination, ATAGI, is yet to recommend boosters for anyone outside this group, but says it'll make a call by the end of the month. Shadow Health Minister Mark Butler thinks Australia risks falling behind.
We're already seeing older members of the communities in the UK, the US and many other countries already receiving their booster shots today. Are we going to see yet again something that's too little, too late from Scott Morrison on booster shots?
But the Dean of Health Science at Swinburne University, Professor Bruce Thompson, says Australia is actually ahead of the game on boosters.
We're one of the people that actually, are in the leadership pack, I suppose, of actually starting to look at booster doses. There seems to be really quite good evidence that suggests these, groups of people, and that's a large group of people, that may need another dose, and let's just get on with it.
The official advice is that severely immunosuppressed people are eligible for a booster between 2 and 6 months after their second dose. And it's better that the third dose is a different type of vaccine. Professor Thompson explains.
So what ATAGI have recommended is that if you have taken AstraZeneca style vaccine, so in terms of its mechanism, they're making a suggestion that you switch over to the mRNA vaccine type vaccines, which is Moderna and Pfizer. They're saying that's our recommendation, or that's our suggestion. It's by no means you have to do it that way. If you can only get an AstraZeneca vaccine, that is perfectly fine. But there's sort of reasons why you'd think of mixing up the modes of actions a little bit. It potentially just, gets the immune system from another number of different angles.
The extra immune boost will be needed in coming months in 2 states in particular. Victoria posted by far the highest ever single-day tally of cases by an Australian state today, 1,838 new cases, and a predicted peak in this wave is still weeks away. In contrast, New South Wales has recorded 646 new cases, continuing a downward trend in the outbreak. But with a major relaxation in restrictions coming on Monday, COVID is expected to spread again, putting the unvaccinated and vulnerable at considerably more risk.
That story by Isabel Rowe, David Sparks and Rhett Burney. Well, so much of what the government has planned for the coming months has been based on the Doherty Institute's modelling about vaccine rates and the easing of restrictions. But what does the man behind the name Doherty think of where we're at in this pandemic? Professor Peter Doherty, the patron of the Doherty Institute, wasn't actually involved in preparing the modelling, but he did win a Nobel Prize in 1996 for his work on killer T cells and immune response. And on this Nobel week, I asked him how much faith we should put in double-dose vaccination status ahead of an expected spike in cases as states start easing restrictions.
Well, basically, the vaccines are working in other countries that are much more open than we are to massively reduce hospitalisations and deaths. They're not necessarily stopping transmission because vaccinated people can still become infected up in the nose and transmit, but they're having a very positive effect. So we've had a strategy where we're going to open up depending on the level of vaccination. And when we get to 80% of the over 16-year-olds is kind of the break point. So, but quite frankly, we'll all be part of a big experiment when we do that.
What do you mean by that, a big experiment?
Well, we've done our best, and government has also done its best to take advice, but basically we're at the mercy of the virus, but also we're at the mercy of human behaviour and how well people will comply with various things required of them. And we can see that sort of willingness to comply is fraying a lot around the edges from what we've seen recently in Victoria.
There are people who have been double vaccinated who are still very worried about the time when we start really opening up. What's your message to them?
Well, I'm part of that group because I'm 80 years old. I'm double vaccinated with AstraZeneca, and one summary would be my susceptibility profile is now like that of a 50-year-old. So particularly older people, particularly the frail elderly, and I'm far from that category, are very much at risk even though they are double vaccinated because they just don't make very good immune responses due to the fact that their immune systems have declined. So they're very much at risk. And you can still get reasonably unwell from what we call a breakthrough infection. It'll likely be just up in the nose and the respiratory tract and not get around your body and the blood. But and you probably won't need to go to hospital, but you can still get a bit unwell from it.
Should Australians be getting a third dose while many millions of people around the world still can't get their first?
Well, quite frankly, it's our government and our taxes that are being paid. And it's very, very clear that if you, as time goes by, the level of antibody protection is falling. And that as the level of antibody protection, these are the antibodies in your blood, fall off, then people are more likely to be infected in the nose, particularly, and to transmit. So boosting could help to reduce that transmission and also reduce the risk. We have, I believe, given quite a lot of AstraZeneca vaccine to Pacific Island nations, and I think some to Indonesia, and we could certainly do a lot more of that. But I do think our government has an obligation to its own citizens first.
The vaccine uptake in some jurisdictions here in Australia is just off the charts. New South Wales is approaching 90% first dose coverage. The ACT 96% today. Can we reach a lasting herd immunity with that sort of coverage, or will variants keep creeping in from overseas?
Yes, we will certainly reach herd immunity in one sense, but that won't be the type of herd immunity we're used to with measles, where if everyone's vaccinated, the virus is not circulating. We don't know really if this virus will continue to circulate with the level of transmission we'll get from breakthrough infections in vaccinated people. If we've got 98% of people vaccinated, we're going to find out. The question is trying to get those last percentage of people who are either uncomfortable about the vaccination or against vaccination across the barrier. If we could do that, that would be great. If we can't, they're at great risk.
You've spent a bit of time personally trying to convince people on social media with quite an interesting approach, a very patient and tolerant approach, it must be said. Have you convinced anyone, do you think, to actually get the vaccine?
I think it's probably helped some people because many people do. Many people have fears of vaccines. People are afraid of needles, for instance, and hopefully one can get some people across that barrier. The vaccine can have some side effects. Everything we do in medicine has some risk to it, but the risk of getting the infection is infinitely greater than any risk from the vaccine.
That's Nobel Prize winner Professor Peter Doherty there, the patron, in fact, of the Doherty Institute. Australia's closest neighbour is confronting a surge in COVID cases. Papua New Guinea, its biggest hospital, Port Moresby General, has closed non-essential services and a temporary coronavirus field hospital has been established in the city. Resources are being stretched even further by alarming rates of transmission in regional areas as health workers from the capital are sent to assist. Senior doctors now say the crisis will soon require international help. PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting reports.
At the gates of Papua New Guinea's biggest hospital, a security officer speaks on a loudspeaker, telling people that the hospital is closed for non-essential services and people can't gather there. The CEO of Port Moresby General, Dr. Paki Malumi, says a recent surge in COVID-19 cases is putting pressure on staff and beds.
In the last 24 hours, we've seen 6 out of every 10 patients coming with symptoms of cough, fever, tested for COVID have been testing positive. Towards the end of September, the positivity rate was around 31%. In the last 24 hours, that has increased to 61%. So basically, every day there is an increasing number of cases coming to the hospital.
There are almost 100 patients here, and another temporary COVID field hospital has also opened. He's concerned about the days and weeks ahead.
We are quite worried because the vaccination rate is very, very low. If we have a very low vaccination rate and high rate of infection that's coming into the hospital, we may come to a stage where we will not be able to handle the numbers that come into the hospital. So this is a big worry for us.
Cases are rising not just in Port Moresby, but across the country as the Delta variant spreads. In Goroka, a city in the Highlands, at least 40 people have died in the past month, but doctors there say more deaths are yet to be included in the official statistics. Emergency oxygen has been helicoptered in 4 times in the past week as the hospital ran close to running out. Now, extra staff are also being flown in. An 8-person emergency medical team has been sent from Port Moresby. Clinical nurse Petros Savaiko is among them.
The need is very serious at the moment. We have staff that are going down, especially in the isolation ward. We have 15 staff nurses at the moment, and in terms of the cases that are rising and the deaths over the past month, it's very serious, and we're there to basically assist them, give them a helping hand so that they can get back up on their feet.
Another emergency medical team has flown to Mount Hagen to help at that hospital. PNG doesn't have enough health professionals even outside of a pandemic. There's about 1 doctor per 14,000 people. Dr. Gary No has been coordinating the emergency medical teams and says it's a juggling act.
So this particular team of 8 people are a team that were previously deployed to Vanimo. They've come back to Moresby, rested, but because of the need in Eastern Islands, they've actually volunteered to go to Eastern Islands, Goroka, to help out as well. I commend them on their humanitarian spirit.
Do you think there'll still be a need to potentially call on international EMTs, depending on what happens with your manpower shortages?
Yes, so there is a need for international EMTs, and from our meeting yesterday with the higher level leaders and the head of our country, we are going to request for international EMTs, but that's above my level. The health minister and through his office will formally do those arrangements and announcements, but yes, definitely we will request assistance. But as you know, the whole world is facing surges at the moment, and everywhere, even our neighbors are facing such surges that require international EMTs. So the response will be slow and limited, and hence why we as a nation need to respond first and then allow for international teams, the ones that do respond, to come in and further add on to that surge.
When cases surged in March and April, a health team came over from Australia. Port Moresby General CEO Dr Parky Malumi also thinks additional help will be needed again.
This trend continues. Definitely we will need overseas assistance, not only for Port Moresby, but throughout the country as well, because there are surges happening in all parts of the country.
Vaccination rates in PNG remain incredibly low. Just under 3% of the eligible population has had at least one dose of a vaccine. Health authorities are hoping this surge will prompt more people to go and get the jab. This is Natalie Whiting in Port Moresby for PM.
Advocates of voluntary assisted dying in the ACT and the Northern Territory have been dealt a blow, with the Federal Attorney-General, Michaelia Cash, ruling out legislative changes which would have allowed them to pass laws relating to euthanasia. The territories have been barred from doing so since the 1990s, and despite all other jurisdictions, except for New South Wales, having legalised voluntary assisted dying, the federal government won't budge when it comes to Canberra and the NT. Jamie Travers has the latest.
For Katerina Pavkovic, when it comes to talking about voluntary assisted dying laws, it's personal.
He got to a point in time where he couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, he couldn't eat anymore.
Her father, Naisha, battled Parkinson's for many years, and while he no longer had control over his body, there was one thing he was adamant about.
He got to a point in time in his life where he made the choice that he really didn't want to live anymore.
But 5 years ago, the ACT, where he lived, like most of the country at the time, had no voluntary assisted dying laws. Naisha Pavkovic died in palliative care. His final breaths laboured, his body hooked up to machines pumping more and more morphine into his system to deal with his pain. And now, despite most of the country having passed laws legalising voluntary assisted dying, the ACT and the Northern Territory, along with New South Wales, are the only places that haven't. And while New South Wales is gearing up for a debate around the topic later this year, the two territories aren't allowed to due to this law from 1997.
The federal parliament has voted to overturn the Northern Territory's voluntary euthanasia law by a margin of 38 to 33. Early this morning, after
and for close to 25 years, campaigners in the territories have tried to repeal the law as more and more countries agreed to allow euthanasia. And with voluntary assisted dying legalised in Queensland, South Australia and Tasmania this year, proponents in the ACT and the Northern Territory believe that now was the time. In March, the Human Rights Minister for the ACT and the NT's Attorney-General wrote a joint letter to the federal government asking them to look at repealing the law blocking territories from legislating around euthanasia. This week, 7 months after they first wrote, the Attorney-General, Michaelia Cash, responded, saying that while
the government recognises that members of the community have strong views about dying with dignity, compassion and with minimal pain.
The Attorney-General goes on to say,
while I appreciate the diversity of views, the government does not have any current plans to introduce legislation to repeal the Euthanasia Laws Act of 1997.
That response, frankly, is not worth the paper that it's written on.
Tara Chain is the ACT's Human Rights Minister.
It is appalling in its lack of detail.
For her, this boils down to a matter of geographical discrimination.
I'm speaking to you from central Canberra, and 20 kilometres away in New South Wales, in Queanbeyan, the citizens there already have more rights than we do in the ACT.
But not everyone within the federal government agrees with the Attorney-General. Sam McMahon is a country Liberal senator for the Northern Territory. She's introduced a private member's bill to restore rights to the Northern Territory, which would include the right to legislate voluntary assisted dying.
It's not fair that people living in the ACT or the Northern Territory are treated as second-class citizens.
While her bill only deals with the NT, she says that ACT senators are welcome to pass amendments to include the Capital Territory. And she's been surprised by the response from many on her side.
I do believe that there is enough support for this bill from both sides of the Senate.
It's not the first time the senators used her position in the Senate to push for territory rights. Last year, she worked with members across the aisle to legislate so that the Northern Territory maintained 2 seats in the House of Representatives, despite the Australian Electoral Commission advising that it only needed 1 due to a declining population.
I got that through by convincing my colleagues to come on that journey with me because it was the right thing to do.
For Kat Pavkovic, it isn't about politics, it's about people like a dad.
It's incredibly traumatic. We knew it was coming to an end. Because of the nature of it, it became way more prolonged in the end than it needed to be.
That's voluntary assisted dying campaigner Katrina Pavkovic. Jamie Travers reporting. And that's PM for this week. PM's supervising producer is Nick Grimm. Technical production by Scott Johnston. I'm David Lipson. Linda Mottram's along with This Week in the Morning on how to build a credible national integrity watchdog and why coal and gas prices could get even more volatile.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.